earlier. But I'm representing the panel here together with Murray. And the objective of this panel is to produce policy relevant evidence on the interactions between population dynamics and inequality and climate change. So we thought that this conference was a good moment to bring together a panel that makes us think about these issues. And we are aware that when we mention the title of our panel, we actually cover probably 80% of the challenges that the world is facing today, which go from the demographic pressures to the demographic dividends, from inequality between and within countries, to how responding to climate change can actually help us reimagine a society which would be more equal. So today we brought together this panel because we really want to hear about these interlinkages between population, inequality, and climate change from practitioners and policy experts and academics, and more specifically, how these interactions are reflected in their work, and what are the different interesting initiatives that can help us shape our thinking. So on our panel, we have Mike Savage from LSE, we have Rachel Yavinsky from the Population Reference Bureau, we have Saliem Fakir, who's leading the African Climate Foundation, and we have Devan Pillay from the Presidential Climate Commission, who's leading the work around inequality and employment. Now, as you've heard me, the first term that we have on our IUSSP panel is population. So, Rachel, I will then start with you. And given that you are an expert on the population health and environmental approach, we would like to hear a bit more from you on what the approach is, what are its principles, etc.
Okay, hi. So the population health and environment approach, I don't know if any of you have heard of it, it's often known as PHE, and it is an integrated multi-sectoral approach to addressing social and environmental challenges that communities face. And it really integrates primary health care, including family planning and reproductive health, with helping communities conserve the natural resources that they depend on for livelihoods and food security and things like that. Going to talk about that P in population. This is it's really important to define what at least I mean when I'm talking about this term and what PHE means when we're talking about this term. Population is often thought of when it's related to climate change as something that you can look at and you can use family planning to address population growth or to limit population growth with the idea that that will ultimately reduce emissions and mitigate climate change. That is not what I'm talking about today, and that is not what PHE works to address. The PHE approach is focused on, uses the word population to refer to voluntary family planning that helps women at an individual level achieve their fertility desires and needs. If you look at individual communities who are impacted by climate change, many of them will still see population as being about population dynamics and how much growing, their population is doing, or how old their population is, or how young their population is, and they look at that and how family planning can impact those population dynamics in their striving to adapt to climate change. But really what my focus is in talking about this is on that voluntary family planning for individual women. And I'm going to say the word voluntary a lot because I want to be really careful about that. I think it's really important. In addition to that, like I said, PHE programs integrate that family planning piece with a lot of different other pieces that you'll see often in community-based conservation programs, One Health programs, people-centered conservation. There's a lot of different words for it. They address things having to do with livelihoods, sustainable agriculture, fisheries, water and sanitation programs, sanitary latrines, clean water programs, clean cook stoves, wildlife management, and things like that all together. But really the piece that sets PHE apart from other community-based conservation programs is that family planning and population piece.
Great. If you can still have one more minute if you need to.
I'm good for now. I'm sure I'll have more chance.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much. So, Saliem, Rachel mentioned the importance of also local-led adaptation approaches, and we know that that ACF has been done some incredible work across the continent supporting governments in tackling climate change. So maybe you can tell us more about your work on that.
Thank you very much. I thought maybe what I'll do is just give you the framework of how the work of ACF is guided. ACF is the African Climate Foundation. We're 3 years old. We started in April 2020. We operate in South Africa, Namibia, DRC, Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal. All countries that are important for various reasons. I just want to remind people that the continent is not a uniform place. It's 54 countries or 55, depending how you want to deal with the Sahrawi region, which is under occupation by Morocco. They all have different norms and different political systems and governance structures. We try to tackle the issue of climate, and I think we're trying to develop a different narrative, and our focus is entirely around the climate development nexus, because we can't talk about climate issues in what I would say a very Eurocentric way, which is basically people trying to engineer energy transitions on a continent, except for South Africa, in which the emissions profile is very low, or talk about climate risk as if it's an aid issue. What we are interested in is the way in which climate risk impacts key economic sectors. I've seen some presentations earlier. What we are interested in is how it degrades the capability of those sectors to sustain themselves in the longer term, which are critical to the economies of those countries. Some of those sectors are in this case agricultural sectors that are vital for jobs, for exports, and they're a sizable portion of the GDP of those countries. There are other parts of the continent that are highly reliant on commodities trade. So we're really interested in climate risk in terms of its the frequency of these risks to degrade the assets and the capabilities of key economic sectors. So we are interested also in issues around fiscal space and the ability of the government to invest in programs that are improving the economic base of society as a whole. So you can't define everything around income, but income is essential. More importantly is also governance issues like political rights and opportunity for people to exercise choices in whichever domain they are. So this is a issue of a longer term. So we want to take climate risk away from an aid debate to a more constructive debate about its place in an economy of a specific country. On the other side, on what they classically call mitigation, we're really interested in the integration of cheaper sources of, for example, electrification that can improve energy access, reduce energy poverty, and also achieve longer-term goals of reduction in carbon emissions by lowering the dependency on fossil fuels. All of those have to make sense in relationship to the country's ability to grow in a sustainable manner, its ability to sustain more sustainable economies that are not entirely commodity dependent. So economic diversification is crucial. And the last part is the ability, especially through integration, through electrification, is the integration of these economies within the region and into the global economy, especially a young labor force that we require to ensure there's growth in jobs. And this is a continent, the major trends are, it's going to be the quarter of the world's population. People don't realize that. Very youthful population, high levels of urbanization, lots of ingenuity on the ground, and creating the enabling environment for that to be exercised. So we really want to move away from a traditional conversation of climate to a more broader framework and structure around economic transformation and diversification. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Now, South Africa, and Simon also mentioned, but South Africa has been at the forefront of the climate commitments. And we know that the Presidential Climate Commission has played a crucial role in that. This morning, Devan has mentioned a little bit the Just Transition Framework, but maybe Devan can tell us a bit more, because I'm not sure that everyone is familiar with the PCC, the Presidential Climate Commission. So can you tell us more about the objectives and the current role?
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. The Presidential Climate Commission roots are in the last Presidential Jobs Summit, and it then materialized and is now being further enforced and or rather institutionalized through the climate bill that's currently being consulted nationally. And if I'm correct, it's probably now with the NCOP, so it's going to the various provinces for that consultation process. And essentially what will happen thereafter is if the bill is ascended, the Presidential Climate Commission then becomes an institution of the state. And will work very similar to those that know heard of NEDLAC, will work on a very similar basis. So the main objectives of the PCC is to provide government with scientific evidence-based recommendations on issues of climate change and broadly the just transition. And to a large extent, the organization works as a interface between various stakeholders and the state. Deeply embedded in its character is the concept of building consensus from a diverse range of stakeholders. And as you would know, dealing with stakeholders, you have a plethora of views and significant volumes of ideas that need to be considered when in the space of policy development or strategy development. This takes a huge effort in terms of bringing those divergent views together, and that's a very critical role that the PCC plays. While it's not yet a formal state institution, its current composition is made up of a number of key government ministers. The labor unions are represented by the various federations. You've got a host of civic organizations that's represented on the council. The last objective is, while developing these policies and strategies, it is not our intent to get into operations, but to a large extent, we nudge in that direction. And we do that by developing or guiding on policy development, working with institutions, and trying to unblock as far as possible the challenges that they may be experiencing, and particularly when it comes to significant stakeholders that we're able to get buy-in quickly from. So we work within the three broad frameworks. One is on mitigation, and mitigation basically looks at all factors around what would be the impact of the just transition, and how do we mitigate the adverse impact of the just transition. A large chunk of this work is actually deals with modeling, deals with outsourcing research on the energy sector. And a large chunk of that is actually focusing on a net zero economy. And within the research environment, there's the modeling element that we're building capacity on and trying to bring together the dialogues around best projections moving forward. Deeply embedded within the mitigation unit is issues dealing with employment and skills, and looking at what would future economies be in various regions of South Africa. We have the adaptation unit, which looks at costing of adaptation, looks at costing of resilience, and to a large extent is building knowledge around the whole area of climate adaptation and resilience. The third element is looking at finance, and to a greater extent, this unit functions within the PCC and gives effect to what has been, or what most people know is the Presidential Climate Financial Task Team, and they do a lot of the groundwork in terms of the jet costing. So this looks at mobilizing resources, mapping where resources flows are, looking at new technologies, and is in the concept of developing what's known as the Just Transition Fund. How do you capacitate this, the design of the fund, etc. Right now, many of you may be aware and participating in what's going in the last 5 weeks. We've been consulting extensively on the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. Please note that the investment plan is actually a plan of government, and we're assisting as the PCC to embed the entire envisioned just transition in it. And as part of that, it's the extensive consultations that we've been having. In March alone, there's about 6 more sessions still to be held. And we've engaged with all sectors of society. The first sessions were an information sharing session, just to bring them up to speed in terms of the research and the recommendations. And the second session is then held about 2 to 3 weeks later, where we're able to then engage on the substantive issues. Embedded in all of this work is the just transition elements of deep participation by communities and workers. We've developed the Just Transition Framework, which was approved by Cabinet in late 2022. And to deepen the whole justice process of this, the PCC has developed the partnership implementation model as a methodology for ensuring meaningful stakeholder engagement. And the partnership model basically speaks to engaging all stakeholders, not just in terms of information sharing or hearing one's views, but rather wherever these consultations take place, there should be some sort of partnership that evolves around these engagements. So in summary, that's the broad thrust and objectives of the PCC. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Now, we see how the just transition is shaping up in South Africa, and I think that Mike, in your recent book, actually talk about how inequality defines not only the current challenges but also our approaches. So first of all, would love to hear from you on, also based on your work on elites, how do you see the role of elites in stalling or maybe supporting the social environmental transitions? And maybe then I would have another question more specifically on climate change.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this conference. It's been great to be here. Yeah, I want to link my remarks to what was discussed this morning about the implications of moving from a poverty framing to an issue around inequality. Because I'm a sociologist, and sociologists have historically and traditionally been very concerned not just with people in poverty and people in deprivation, but also people with power and privilege, and the way they act, sometimes in the social good, sometimes in the public good, but quite frequently to feather their own nests and to be self-interested. And what I've become increasingly interested in at the LSE is this issue about how elites, can you hear me? Okay, how elites are part of the problem of we're facing today, because they've been massively empowered by the shift of economic resources towards the wealthy. And thinking of my own experience in the UK, but also in other rich countries, you know, we see this really scary situation whereby we can have extremely impressive scientific and data infrastructure in place, and all sorts of findings and arguments which have a high degree of consensus in the scientific community, and yet the link to the political world, led by our various kinds of elites, is extremely problematic. We saw this in COVID in the case of the UK, when it's very easy to see how our political leaders were influenced by the particular obsessions of their own. And so we really have to take seriously how to think about elites and how to bring elites into this kind of conversation. Now, my perspective on this as a sociologist is to be distant from an approach which is simply saying elites are in themselves a problematic group. There's some people would say we've got to get rid of elites as such. Well, actually, I think if you look historically, you can find examples of situations where elites can be really powerful in leading constructive projects of nation building, of building social contracts, and of developing forms of collaboration, which are really important to the social fabric. On other occasions, they're disruptive of that. So what I think is really important is for us to think about the specific conditions and the specific kinds of people who may form different elites. Now, we're in many rich nations that you're finding groups of wealthy people, for instance, forming different factions, different groups. And in the US, and also now in the UK, there's a group of what are called patriotic millionaires, who are people extremely wealthy, but who say we should be paying more tax because we think we have a public duty to be resourcing and thinking about the public realm. And I think that's really important to think about the different constituencies and the different elements which compose elites. So what we've been doing at the LSE in the last 3 years is developing a project which we have this grand title called the World Elite Database. It's part of a theme of research which we're running on wealth, elites and tax justice, which is doing a comparative study of elites in different countries. So far, mostly European, but we have actually reached out to South Africa, a few countries in South America, and also Asia. And we're thinking about trying to understand the particular dynamics of when elites become, buy into a national project of nation building versus when they become conflictual and when they become tied up with their own instrumental advantages. And we have some early research, in particular comparing countries in Europe, in Scandinavia, in particular, where there is a strong degree of consensus among elites. And these are the countries where you're finding much more buy-in to nation building projects, to think about climate change issues, to think about sustainability. Sustainability being both about climate issues, but also about inequality issues. Where you've got countries, and the UK is a prime example, with a high degree of international, transnational elite formation, that is far more difficult to obtain, and you get far less linkage between political elites and economic and wealthy elites. So this is a really important part of the conversation, I think, to link to the one we're having in this conference.
And can you keep the mic so I can ask you a follow-up question on more specifically the link or the issues that can be posed to the fight against climate change by wealth inequality and by this concentration of elites in power?
Yes. So I think it's really important about how do we tackle the extreme inequalities in wealth and assets which exist in the world, generally across the world, but also in specific countries. We know that the amount of wealth has been accumulating as assets have been inflating in value in recent decades. We know that there are an increasing number of billionaires who have huge prominence across different industrial sectors, across the media, across politics. what do we do about it? So I don't really see myself as a policy expert, but the one area I've got an interest in recent years has been the debate about the wealth tax. Now, the notion of a wealth tax is really saying, you know, we've been taxing income different ways and in different countries for a long time. It's a very familiar part of the rule book of government. The idea of taxing wealth is much less established. There are examples in some countries. There's no consensus about it, but it is gaining increasing interest from a number of public policy interest groups. And this is one example of this is in the UK. And I want to just reflect upon the UK case. UK in the 1970s was one of the most equal countries in the world. It had a relatively low Gini coefficient. In the last 40 years, it's become the second most unequal country in Europe, I think, and one of the more unequal in the world too, driven by its role in the global wealth economy in many respects. It's really important that we are now having a debate about should there be a wealth tax in the UK, which we haven't historically had. We've had tax on land and inheritance, but not wealth as such. And the issue, and my colleagues, Aaron Nadvani and Andy Summers at the London School of Economics led a wealth tax commission 3 years ago, which was very impressive. And if you're interested, you can go on the websites and find out about their reports and their recommendations. And they proposed at that time a one-off wealth tax, just to kind of deal with COVID. It's a one-off wealth tax, the very high threshold. The threshold ranged from £1 million of wealth assets to £5 million. So the vast majority of people would not be paying it. And then it was rated at 5% of your wealth. So it's not about, this is not a revolutionary expropriation of assets. This is really just a little bit of paying back of your asset from the very wealthy. That would raise £260 billion to the UK Treasury. Now, that money is a vast amount, which could tackle all the issues which the UK government is currently grappling with. So to someone like myself, who is a bit innocent of the economics of all these things, it seems like a sort of no-brainer. Now, all sorts of debates about it. One of them is the issue, is it feasible, in terms of a very familiar argument that the wealthy will leave your country if you put in a wealth tax. And my colleagues, again, Andy and Aaron, are doing some very interesting work on this. But the evidence is really not clear that people really do this. I mean, there's a strong tradition in behavioral economics that they do, but actually, in reality, people's lives are often fixed to particular places to a greater or less extent. And so I think we are in a world now where debates about a wealth tax are gathering pace. They were heard in the US election recently. The Labour Party in the UK is probably going to be making more of an issue of them. So I think we are in a very interesting space where I think that needs to be part of the conversation.
Thank you so much. I will refrain myself from asking the question on whether on the fiscal space work that you guys are doing, you're looking at the wealth tax. So I'm not going to ask that. I'm just going to move to Devan because, well, we have talked about the high levels of inequality in South Africa. So it would be interesting to listen from you on how the PCC is actually looking into this nexus and what are the next steps into integrating the inequality and the just transition.
Thank you. I like the thinking around the wealth tax. It's something that we must certainly read. Okay, so when we speak about inequality in South Africa, it's ingrained in every political speech that comes through, and we generally speak about them in terms of the Gini coefficient. I think I just want to take a few minutes just to give you a granular feel of what poverty is like in South Africa. When we look at unemployment rates of 32.7%, regardless of the exact value, but 30% is a huge amount of your labor force that's not employed, which has a direct impact on households. Of that, 69% are in the formal economy, and around 19% are in the informal economy. And what's interesting is research that has been done has demonstrated that countries that are in the same economic level as South Africa have a much larger informal economy. And that helps cushion livelihoods for families. And I think that's the critical thing for us is as we move forward, it's not just about the employment rate or the quantum of people that are employed or unemployed, but rather moving towards a more sustainable household. And you want to lift that household above the poverty line. Between 2003 and 2012, grants have increased for households from 30% to 50%, and for individuals from 13% to 36%. This speaks to the huge reliance on the state to provide income to the absolute poor. And this income is at most often the only source of income households have. And in some situations, particularly in rural areas, you would have a single parent household with not just your immediate family members, but your extended family members that you still need to support. So the grants in South Africa play a very central role in terms of household sustainability. The access to food, around 21% of South African households spoke to either not having adequate food or severely inadequate food. That speaks to a number of developmental issues that we still need to unpack. If I zoom into in Mpumalanga, and the reason I'm doing that is because the just transition focus right now is in Mpumalanga. You have about 18% of the Mpumalanga population saying they have inadequate food. And when you dive deeper and you look at educational levels, around 11% of the province don't have any form of education. There's about 4% that have less than primary school, and about 36% or so that have less than secondary. It tells you that this is one of the intervention points that we need to realize in the province. Unemployment levels in the province, I think it's for the youth, it's chronic, it's consistent, and it's quite deep. It remains at around 40% between the ages of 15 to 35. And those between 36 and 63, it's around 20%. So this is some of the deep issues that we want to deal with as we engage on this just transition. And the thinking is that we should not just be responding to the current crisis, but also take the province to an improved level of economic activity that has a direct impact on the socioeconomic conditions. And that's embedded partly in the just transition framework that was released by the PCC and adopted by Cabinet. If you look at in the just transition, we speak through the what we consider high-risk sectors, which is your coal mining, your power stations, your agricultural sector, your tourism sector, etc. And how do you mitigate against this? And there's a plethora of work that has been done. Some of the research that we've done speaks to a sector job resilience plan, which was done about 2 years ago, and this now needs to be reviewed and needs to be to consider the impact since it's been released and what has happened. Deeply embedded within the just transition is not just the framework, but rather moving towards monitoring what has been the impact of the framework since it's been released. Now, in Mpumalanga, if you look across the three districts, the SAMPI shows that it's between 7.2% and 8.2% of the population are living in dire poverty. So, what are we doing as the PCC to address this? So the one fundamental issue that we're trying to do is firstly deal with the immediate crisis, the immediate energy crisis, and responding to supply side issues. And the reason for that is so that we can get the economy back to levels where it's performing much better, get people back into employment, create the stable environment for the private sector. in terms of the various units of work, the first is, and the just transition generally speaks through a bottom-up approach. What we've done in towards guiding that is looking at developing an employment strategy within Mpumalanga province. And this employment strategy would broadly look at the sectors in Mpumalanga that are best positioned to create jobs, or rather the most labor intensive in sectors. We also will include in there 2 or 3 wildcards, and the wildcards are sectors that don't exist in Mpumalanga, and how do we bring about those sectors. In each sector, there will be a deep dive in looking into the value chain and the benefits of the value chain and how the community can best benefit from this. We're also looking at developing a reviewed or re-envisaged Mpumalanga economy, driven largely by the Office of the Premier. And the idea here is to identify the sectors that will be on a decline or may no longer exist, and look at what other sectors in the province can be expanded to and new sectors that can be developed. Now, just by way of example, if in Mpumalanga, in the Bushbuck Ridge area, there's the vanadium mine. So we now need to look at exploring possibly a battery facility in there and then developing an entire value chain around that. Other examples would be, for example, if you look at the agricultural sector, what we found that even high-value goods, high-value agricultural products, you tend to have greater labor intensity per hectare versus your normal agricultural products such as maize and wheat, etc. Just by way of example, if you have export quality carrots, you can produce 3 jobs per hectare. If you're doing flowers, you can produce 13 jobs per hectare. So the idea is to do deep dives into such sectors and see how best to improve the employment opportunities in the sector. Now, embedded in all of this, very deeply embedded in this, is what we are considering the partnership implementation model. And in here, we're looking at going down to ward levels and engaging with stakeholders at ward levels and trying to come up with partnerships and come up with a partnership with all those key stakeholders on what's best to respond to the employment situation and respond to the economic situation, so you are able to uplift people out of poverty. We're hoping that this model will then lead to at a district level, to a model that the term that government often uses, a district development model, and embed these agreements within the district development model so that you're able to ensure that across all 3 tiers of government commits resources. And if those resources are still, additional resources are required, then relevant role players can be brought in. And at some point, aggregate this to the provincial level where you'll get buy-in from all the critical stakeholders in the province. Other kind of, sorry. Okay, all right, just 2 minutes. Just very quickly. In terms of some of the other work that we're doing is on adaptation and resilience, which I mentioned earlier, and the intent is to develop a adaptation and resilience plan for Mpumalanga, and there's huge potential there for job creation and for job creation and economic opportunities. And the last point is the critical element is in all the programs that we have to put in place, the appropriate monitoring, evaluation, and learning to be embedded so that we're able to monitor the progress and make sure that the desired impact is being met. Thank you.
Wait. No. Thank you so much. If we stick with South Africa, Saliem, you recently wrote a paper, very interesting, on the just the energy transition partnership in South Africa and on the conditions of its success. So what would you say, Tsar, and what would be the lessons from this to other African countries?
So I think we don't know if it's going to be entirely successful. I mean, we have got it as far as we can. We have raised about $8.5 billion. The transition process itself is a lot more, requires a lot more investment than 8.5. It depends what numbers you look at. If you take an extended period of up to 2050, it's 250 billion to 300 billion. But I think there are a number of reasons why I think it was first conceptualized. It wasn't purely just about offsetting a billion gigatons, billion tons of carbon by phasing out coal. There were certain conditions in the country that made sense for the JETP to converge in the form that it did. The one was around, we have old and ailing coal plants that have to come offline, and at least 20 to 22 gigawatts by 2035 to 2040 will have to be retired. That has implications for the coal mining areas, particularly in Mpumalanga, which is where the focus is. The second is we have an energy security problem. We need reforms in the electricity sector. And fourthly, it's a good way to raise cheaper capital because the government budget projections were that it needed between $10 to $14 billion to raise cheaper sources of funding on the open market. So it either stood in a position to get it at 1% or much higher. And it chose a route to use the climate finance angle to be able to raise that. And that is to really invest in new infrastructure that's needed anyway. I just want to tell people that we have run a renewables program without a sense of climate finance. So I think for me, the JETP, the philosophy of it was really a disruptive art scale attempt at a new breaking the coal path dependency, but also combining it with a broader challenge of energy security and economic recovery. And in a very constrained fiscus where the government's borrowing costs were going higher, we had huge debt in Eskom, and you needed to solve multiple problems. That's why I think the JETP is successful. It's not just a climate deal. It's more than a climate deal. There are going to be huge challenges around this. A couple of them. One is that the investments have to go to the right places. There's expectations that investments would lead to better socioeconomic outcomes, and that there would be a tier of multiplier effects as a result of the investment, depending on the geographies and the places where they take place. That are the hidden outcomes of possibly a positive new path dependency, which is to diversify out of coal. If you wanted to look at South Africa's situation outside of its own national sphere, we are going to be confronted with new pressures outside of South Africa with our trading partners, in particular. If, for example, the EU bans internal combustion engines, which I think it has 2 weeks ago, by 2035, where do we export all our manufactured auto vehicles? It's to the EU. Secondly, there's the carbon border tax adjustment. It's for real. It's not some fantasy. It's actually going to happen. We, for example, as ACF, we're in discussions with people, with industry, not only in South Africa, but in Nigeria, Kenya, and in Egypt. And particularly Egypt is very worried about it. For example, the cement industry, fertilizer, and so on. So these are quite real. And there's a huge geopolitical pressure and play in the clean tech space. So eventually we're also going to be forced to take sides in which technologies we choose. So it's already happening with 5G. It's going to start happening with electric vehicles, wind towers, wind turbines, solar. And if we don't position ourselves in this new geopolitical competition, it could affect the scale of the just transition and the energy transition on the continent. So there's when we look at issues around the just transition, it's not interterritorial only. We have to look at it also extraterritorial, look at what's going on around us, we have some tough choices to make. We have two factions. There might be more. One is that so ideologically seeped in the issue that coal is a nationalistic resource. You know, we got to drive the coal train, and everything that has nothing to do with coal is an imperial plot from somewhere else. These are not prudent ways to make decisions. We have to actually understand the nature of our economy in relationship to the globe. What is it that makes it competitive, more agile, and more attuned to the fact that new technologies that are coming on the horizon are actually going to disrupt traditional technologies. So this is not an ideological debate. This is about how you engineer, or not engineer, at least I don't believe in social engineering, but at least adapt a country's economic strategy to circumstances beyond. But we are so steeped in the national politics and the intrigue of the national politics that we are actually losing ground in terms of what's happening internationally. You talk to the EV industry, they're still waiting for the government to not make a plan, but to actually put something in place so the automotive industry can start moving in the right direction. So really some interesting issues about complexities of energy transitions that are about investments, internal investments that are necessary. The just aspects of those can't be solved simply by trying to only look at energy transitions as a mechanism for just transition, particularly in South Africa, which is a highly unequal society. You can't solve the just transition problem only at the level of the energy sector. You actually have to transform the entire nature of the economy itself. And in many countries, the pathway to economic resilience is the path to climate resilience. It's not the other way around. I just have to say that, even if it's provocative. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Saliem talked about the national level and the barriers, and Devan mentioned the bottom-up approaches. So it would be interesting to hear from you on how the evidence that integrated programs responding to local priorities can be used to make public policies more responsive to the challenges of inequality and climate change.
Great, thank you so much. So my understanding of the impacts of climate change is really just supported by what I'm hearing here today, which is that we're seeing them a lot in the most rural, difficult to reach areas. We're also seeing that they are hyper local. Not even do they differ by countries, but more so they differ by districts within the countries, even by communities, even by household. And I think someone mentioned this morning, even within households, you're going to see different impacts on different individuals. And we also see that it's changing really quickly. And in a lot of regions, it's not just that over time the climate is changing, but there are just these sudden and extreme weather events. And finally, just the impacts of climate change are really varied and multi-sectoral. So all of this fits in really well. I know I'm sounding like just an advocate for PHE, but it really indicates that this type of multi-sectoral approach to community-based climate adaptation and looking into that when designing policies is really important. To address the first point that I made about the impacts being very rural, a lot of the communities that are facing already the largest impacts from climate change are very difficult to reach. And it's really difficult to go in there and want to tell them that they need to start addressing some of these environmental concerns when in many cases their most basic needs are not being met. And health is an entry point to working with them on many other issues. Some of these communities, if you go there and you see what their priorities are, their priorities may not necessarily be something that one might traditionally think are related to climate change and resilience building and adaptation. But when you really get to know the communities and you get in there, you might find that that's not, that these things are really related. And oftentimes those things have to do with health. Communities or individuals from communities who participate in these kind of multi-sectoral programs report really high satisfaction and support for these programs because they are able to mold them to what their needs and desires are. Which brings me to that local piece, which is, you know, every community needs to have a very different approach based on what the impacts that they're seeing and based on the culture and based on the needs of those communities. And it's really hard to have regional or national plans for adapting to climate change with that. But I think if the one thing that you can take away from it is that the policies need to be to look at each community at a micro level really on their own. And that goes to the point that was being made earlier that you know, we need really, really specific data for figuring out how to address climate change and how to prepare for climate change in each space. And on the point about how quickly it's adapting, I mean, how quickly everything is changing, there's a ton of examples that these multi-sectoral programs and addressing resilience in a multi-sectoral way helps communities to be much more flexible when these extreme weather events happen. There's a lot of examples of communities where there were active PHE programs that really benefited a lot from having those programs when extreme weather events occurred. One of them, one of the longest running PHE programs is the Blue Ventures program in Madagascar. And they've had many more cyclones and really massive cyclones than they had previously, but one in particular several years ago just decimated some of the communities where they were working. And the trained community health workers were so integrated into many different aspects of the community that through like existing donor channels, they were actually able to become the organizers of clean water programs because the community no longer had access to clean water. And that's just one, I mean, small example of the ways that having these multi-sectoral programs can help communities be more prepared for extreme weather events. And finally, on the point that finally, on the point that the impacts of climate change are so multi-sectoral, this also means that the policies to address them have to be really multi-sectoral and go beyond what have traditionally for many, many years been thought of as environmental policies. And it also means that funding has to be multi-sectoral. And you know, funding needs to come not necessarily from these new multi-sectoral funders, but from reaching across aisles. So from, you know, an organization that funds health programs or a Department of Health needs to be working with a Department of Agriculture and working with a Ministry of Environment, and they need to come together to support, to design policies and to fund policies. And the same thing including for organizations that implement these policies, they don't need to be multi-sectoral organizations that are experts in everything having to do with climate change, but this is really about partnerships and about working together and creating networks for health organizations and environmental organizations and conservation organizations and marine organizations and agricultural organizations to be working together to design programs that are flexible and responsive to community needs.
Great. Thank you so much. We still have time, I think. Yeah, no one is screaming at me, so I guess we still have time to take a couple of questions if there are any. Are there any questions? I don't know if we still have virtual space or not. Okay, we have two at least. Well, I'm going to start in the back this time.
Thanks. So I'm Michelle. Yeah, Saliem, listening to you, I feel that I'm hearing the one world story that Africa needs to catch up with progress and development. Otherwise, we're going to be left behind. And I'm wondering about questions of well-being and how do we think with those that have a relation to the earth and the land, whose knowledges have been discursively erased by modernist ontology that we all now live in. So yes, I don't hear alternatives. And if you're speaking about economic growth and development based on mainstream capitalist extractive economics, then, then as a continent, we actually heading for more trouble than we're in. So yeah, if you could elaborate on the type of economics you're speaking about.
So I'll just be loud. No worries. Thank you. So my question goes in the exact opposite direction to Michelle's. In 2018, WWF published a paper called A Low Carbon Sunrise for the Mining Industry, pointing out that some of the minerals that are needed for, the new energy landscape are to be found in South Africa, and others that we don't have the best resources of. Botswana, for example, has, and others in the sub-region. So I'd be interested in, I was at a dinner party and somebody said, oh, we should form a kind of OPEC of these minerals in sub-Saharan Africa. And I am interested in whether people think that's a good idea or not.
Are there any other questions? Oh, yes, there are. Okay, sorry, I'm going to sick and then come back.
I also had a question about the capitalists as well, I'm afraid. I'm just wondering, this is sort of from Mike and partly for Saliem as well, whether or not you see impact investing, which obviously has been rising a lot in popularity as one of the ways that elite capital can be useful to this process or not. Impact investing.
I want to appreciate all the panelists for excellent discussions. And my question goes to Devan, and thank you for representing the Presidential Climate Commission. I wish just to follow up on your comment in terms of job creation and employment opportunities. And I was just thinking, in my country, Kenya, we have the National Climate Change Council that was recently gazetted, and we had a group of Kenyans who are not satisfied. They went to court. So we currently still don't have a National Climate Council. So I appreciate you for representing you as well. So in terms of employment and job creation, what are the considerations that you put in place to make sure that the green jobs that you're creating are also decent jobs, meaning that they have social protection, the government is willing to have dialogue with the unemployed population and the employers? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I can add my list, my question on wealth tax in the fiscal space in South Africa to those. Who wants to go first?
Michelle always asks a tough question. I hope you're still reading Deleuze and Guattari. I think I don't think anybody's got a magic wand. The facts on the ground are that the current debt level of Africa is very high. It's actually double from what it was originally. It's about 700 billion. The only answer I can give is that you've got to improve the conditions even under the current circumstances in order to be able to try to make a better world. I say that in a very risky way because I think it's a very tough journey. We had a dream of a promise in South Africa, and we have not created a better world. In fact, we've seen a decline. So you have to ask, why is it that current ability to have we have a low growth. I don't have a problem with growth. I think the issue is not about growth. It's about the nature of the growth in terms of the externalities it produces and the ability to be able to deal with unequal wealth. And fundamentally, if you improve basic things like municipal services, you can go a long way. I'll give you an example. I worked in Rustenburg, The basic failure of being able to provide decent municipal services means that the average wage of, even though it's been comparatively low for mine workers who have to support a household of 5 people, most of which are unemployed, basic services like water, electricity, even access to affordable food in a booming mining town where there's already an inflation effect on food, and then you've got loan sharks, etc. Simple things like public medical health care. If those services are not available, workers have to pay out of their pocket. That's a degradation of the income. Depending on where they live, the transport costs are extremely high. I was today in a Golden Arrow depot to learn about what they're doing with electric vehicles. They target a market of about people of minimum wage of 7,000 per month. Guess how much they spend on transport? It's close to 1,500 rand. So these all relate to, you can't build a utopia on a broken system, even in the existing status. So we have to ask, what are we doing to fix even the basic things like what we have at the moment? Break the monopoly of the elite. And by the way, a thinker like Walter Seidel was written on this kind of stuff, has argued that historically, the only way you flatten wealth is through war, disease, revolution, and things and catastrophic events. They have never happened through reforms, by the way. It depends on the asymmetry of power between citizens and the elite. That influences how you break the nature of inequality. As a foundation, we're actually experimenting with the donut economics in Saldanha. I know you're a fan of the donut economics. We've got to try out these. we got to try out these things. I don't think Africa should be subject to degrowth when the rest of the world is pumping green energy to keep the growth that they're having and not reducing consumption. I think we have to look at more fundamental issues that are on the continent. It might sound as sacrilege to you, Michelle, but you don't have an answer. You have an idea and an ideology. So try out something in practice and see how it does. Then we can talk about alternative examples. And frankly, a lot of alternative examples, let's be real about them. I know of them, have been utter failures. So you have to ask, why is that the case? So we can't have a dreamy idea of utopia. It's good to have an idea of utopia, but we also have a real world in which certain things as they exist now have to be fixed in this country. As I said, you too focus on the idea of growth, etc. But we have to look at the relative power of people who are abused by an exploitative system. And they need to be properly organized in order to be able to put pressure back, whether you take the reform route or there's high risk in a revolutionary route, and we have to be aware of it. You just have to look at the Arab Spring. It has been mixed results across the different regions. In fact, in some countries, it led to civil war. Now, if that's the kind of utopia you want, be my guest. So I think we have to really be realistic about the process of change. We have to do experiments, and we have to understand how do we make the current system, even though it's bad, better. And that gives us resources to actually do the kinds of alternative stuff that we're talking about. We are working with Louise organizations in different parts of the continent to look at better deals for producer countries that are actually involved in the critical minerals space. I don't know how that's going to work. Many of them what people don't realize is that many countries that are in trade relations with other countries that are exploiting the resources have investment frameworks that are not favorable to those countries that are exporting the minerals. In fact, in West Africa, they have the Energy Charter, in which if they're oil and gas companies operating in those countries. By the way, European countries are not part of the oil and gas charter. They actually, sorry, the energy charter. They actually, many of the states are actually dropping their membership of it. So, example, why is the energy charter important? Is that if there's an oil and gas company operating in your country, and let's say you subject that sector to displacement through cleaner energy and so on, and the profits of those companies are going to be lost, they can sue the country. So these are hidden mechanisms that exist in these countries. So even countries that are seeking to grow their economies are subject to adverse investment frameworks and so on that undermine their long-term ability to grow resources, which is basically about accumulation. You don't have a problem with accumulation if it's done in the right way, and being able to invest in the capabilities and the interests of their population. And then we can do a lot of experiments on donut economics and many other things. Thanks.
Thank you. Quickly on, I'm not an expert on impact investment, but it's better than non-impact investment as far as it's investing in more sustainable things. But I think the issue for me is we've got to be careful of the implication or the ideological implication possibly that therefore the private sector can sort out these issues by themselves. It's what I think is crucial too is to ensure that there's a strong buy-in to the state, into government services, to the public sector, which involves the solution through some kind of taxation and mechanism in that way. And I would just in terms of these conversations about capitalism and so forth, I kind of, I wouldn't say I'm particularly in favor of capitalism abstractly, but we are in a capitalist world. In Milanovich's book, Capitalism Alone is absolutely right. That's the world we're in. And we might wish we were somewhere else, but that's the reality. So how do we work within that reality? I don't think having ideological discussions about an abstract arguments is as useful as thinking about how do we try and move things forward. So with respect to inequality, we can spend a long time discussing how much inequality is reasonable in order to be encouraging and develop motivations and incentives, and how much is unreasonable. That's an important conversation to be had, but I ought to just think recognizing or thinking about when is inequality extreme and too great to be sustained. So I think the issue about inequality is an argument about sustainability. Now we can have that debate as to what is too high, but to give one commonly used statistic from the US actually is that in the 1960s, the chief executives of the top firms, their salary was 20 times as greater than average pay in those firms. Now it's 400 times. I mean, I think most people would say that is excessive, and possibly 20 times is excessive, but getting it closer to 20 times is at least a starting point. And I think thinking about, richness, what is too much wealth, we are not having a debate about that, but we are having a bit of a debate, but we need more of a debate about that. And it's the kind of, which goes back to donut economics and to some extent the kind of degrowth argument. So I think that's the kind of area we need to be moving into.
I'm going to let it
Thank you. So how do we ensure that the jobs are created are decent jobs? This will be largely regulated by the labor regime in South Africa. So you currently have the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, and you have the Labor Relations Act, which largely regulates the employment environment. I'm not going to speak about the other Skills Development Act, etc. So what's critical is wherever the jobs are being created, if it falls within a sector that's already regulated, those standards would have to be met. So almost every sector in the current South African economy has a bargaining council, and the bargaining council then determines the working relationship in that entire sector, and companies are then required to comply with that bargaining council agreements, whether it's on wage, leave, working conditions, etc., etc. However, the important thing is the new sectors that may be emerging, may not necessarily or comfortably fall within existing sectors. And these new sectors have already been flagged for discussions, excuse me, within what we call NEDLAC, which is a body representing government, labor, business, and community. So they've already started the debate in that forum about sectors that are not comfortably embodied within the existing regime. And once those reach a policy discussion, it's then taken to the next level where regulation is then developed by government to assist the sectors then to formalize their agreements. And the sectors themselves, as worker representatives and business, then determines the environment for that particular sector. Thanks.
Oh yeah, I'm not really, I don't really think any of the questions address my area. I'm sorry. Oh,
You can
thank
still
you. I
have it.
appreciate that. I mean, I will say, I'm sort of to your point. I mean, I think that at least climate adaptation supports a bottom-up approach and not just looking at job creation, which is, of course, very important, particularly in urban areas and suburban areas, but livelihood creation and livelihood maintenance and development and focus on alternative livelihoods, not just like the big tech ones. And that also, you know, feeds into, I mean, the cities and urban areas really need to be prepared, because if livelihoods in rural areas and food security in rural areas is not able to be supported sustainably long-term, that is just massive regular influx into cities much more, which of course then, you know, creates an additional burden.
Thank you so much. We're going to end here with not too big of a delay, but I think Britta has an announcement to make.
Wait, can I just say quickly, I knew that I would have a lot to say and not have a lot of time. So I have some handouts down here if anyone wants any more information.
All right, thank you. Yeah, thanks for a fascinating panel. I really only wanted to tell you where dinner is, but after this discussion, I feel like I need to say a bit more. Because I think Saliem and Michelle, you're actually not that far away. I know that you know each other and you keep having this conversation. But I just wanted to also, I know, I'm very aware, I've been spending quite a while in these rooms as well. And that's why I just wanted to remember our friend Raz again, who in the morning made the point, I don't think you will hear that, but just remember, as a species, we're going extinct by our own actions. And we're ruining the basis of our livelihoods. And whatever it is that grows, whether it is our dinner or our economy, is going to be depleting. So at what point do we overthrow our conventions, our technologies, and our practices that actually keep us on this trajectory? And that is the question that I think we really need to ask ourselves. And actually, we've also been asking ourselves when we were putting together this symposium, there were quite a few people who asked me, who are the keynotes? It was like, what? Keynotes in an inequality session? So we got rid of keynotes. We got rid of academic titles, I think, with the exception for Sue, because she's our big boss now. But basically, I thought we were still quite conventional in what we're doing and the way that we're sharing our knowledge. And I really had a great time listening to everybody's research, but then I had this kind of like death by PowerPoint starts with this first bullet. Yes, that one. So that's why I wonder, even for tomorrow, I looked at the program, which I'm sorry, I was also quite involved in putting together, but we have a PowerPoint overload. And do we need that? Do we maybe find other ways of sharing our research? Would it be conversation style? We've got posted. What else can we do to actually share and be in the conversation that gets us to the point of actually changing the convention that keep us on our trajectory towards extinction? Anyway, that was long talk towards dinner. Dinner is, as you walk out on the left, there's the Stonebreakers restaurant. It's a 2-short walk between what you actually biologically and physiologically need between sitting all this time and the restaurant. So remember the audio walk. You can do that, or you can disappear into the waterfront, but please keep yourselves moving, and we'll see you, I think, at 7. Is that right? Okay, thank you.